So it's taken decades. That's why the public's going, what's going on? Where do all these sharks come from? Because it takes decades for their populations to recover. And it's been happening. So in addition, I would argue that it's not just protection and better fisheries management that's allowed that to happen. We're seeing a restoration of ecosystem function. So I would argue that recovery of white sharks is probably our greatest conservation success story. I would argue that that shows that animals at the top of the food chain are the ones most susceptible in the ocean to ocean conditions. And if we can bring them back, that's a sign of things actually getting better.
Welcome back, Dr. Chris Lowe. Chris has been here before. 2013 was the last time for some of you that might have seen him. Chris is actually born and raised on Martha's Vineyard, so he comes from New England. Long legacy of fishing and whaling as part of his family, but grew up diving and fishing off of the islands, and New England and Fisheries is part of his legacy and his family lineage, so I know it's always exciting for him to be back here. But he didn't stick around. He headed elsewhere, and in 1998, when he was finishing his PhD at the University of Hawaii, he was fortunate to land a faculty position at the University of California, Long Beach, replacing very legendary shark biologist Don Nelson, who was an early pioneer of acoustic telemetry techniques to track sharks. You'll be learning more about some of those technologies tonight as Chris and members of his lab at UC Long Beach and the Shark Lab do a lot of tracking work using modern, sophisticated technologies to better understand the biology, behavior, and physiology of sharks, including the use of autonomous robotic devices, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about tonight. And the center of his talk tonight is going to be on juvenile white sharks, young in the year white sharks that occur just in nearshore waters off the California coast. And Chris is going to be describing a nursery area there, which should be really, really exciting, especially since we, of course, have our season of the shark coming up. We're going to start to hear a lot about white sharks in our own waters in the next several weeks.
So tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in California with white sharks, but I also want to tell you a little bit of the history of what we've learned. Let's see if I can make this thing work. So, you know, interesting thing is about 30 years ago, if you were to ask shark biologists what we knew about white sharks, the problem is you probably wouldn't get a lot of information. In fact, if you look at Jaws in the movie and the book, that was probably the most information that we knew about white sharks at the time. So the interesting thing is that 25 years ago, if you'd gone to any biologist in the Pacific and said, what kind of shark is a white shark? We would have probably said, well, white sharks are a coastal shark. And if you said, well, why do you think that? We would say, well, you know, there are these places up off the Farallon Islands that in the fall months, between, you know, usually November and January, these big fat elephant seals come in, give birth to their babies, and surprisingly, right after that, these critters show up along the coast. So biologists could actually see white sharks feeding on these seals right along the coastline. So at the time, if you were to ask a shark biologist what kind of shark a white shark was, he'd say, well, they're coastal sharks because we see them along the coast in the fall. So we also know a little bit more about white sharks based on fishing records. In fact, that's some of the most archived information that we have. So our fishing records in the Pacific date back about 100 years. And if we comb through those records, it's not surprising that white sharks have been interacting with commercial fisheries or recreational fisheries for almost 100 years now. Most of those interactions have occurred in fisheries that occur in coastal waters. So we actually combed through a bunch of those records, my students and I, and not surprising, we found that the most common fishery that white sharks interacted with were entanglement fisheries. Entangled nets or gill nets. So over 80% of all the records we can find in any fishery indicated that white sharks being caught in any fishery were caught in gill net fisheries. And if you look at basically the color, that the blue color is YOY. YOY stands for young of the year. That's a shark less than 1 year old. So a bulk of the sharks being caught in any of the commercial fisheries, particularly in the gill net fishery, were babies. But it's not surprising that adults weren't being caught in a lot of other commercial fisheries because the gear simply couldn't stop animals that large. So when we look at where sharks were reported caught in California, so this is the Southern California Bight. So we have Santa Barbara up there at Point Conception. San Diego is the US-Mexico border. Those blocks that you see are Department of Fish and Game fishing blocks. So when commercial fishers report their catch, they only have to say what block they caught it in. So these are for adults. And one of the things you'll notice is that adults are only caught really in the offshore island blocks, and not very many of them were reported caught historically. If we compare that to juveniles, we see that juveniles are, yeah, they're caught occasionally by the offshore blocks, but it's more also along the inshore. But when we look at the babies, the young of the year, that's when we see this pattern of sharks being caught very, very close to shore. In fact, we see areas like Ventura, Santa Barbara, Santa Monica Bay, Huntington Beach, Dana Point, and northern San Diego County accounted for the bulk of the locations where commercial fisheries had caught baby white sharks. So that tells us a little bit about where white sharks were being found just based on fishing records. Now, we also know that white sharks are vulnerable to overfishing. As apex predators, they never occur in high numbers, but they have life histories much like people. So males reach sexual maturity somewhere between 7 and 9 years old, females between 10 and 12 years old. They may live to be up to 70 years old, maybe even older, depending on what vertebrae you get to look at. And of course, they produce very few young. Females may only give birth every 2 to 3 years. So in many ways, they're much like people in terms of the life history. In addition, when they were caught, they were of value. A set of adult white shark jaws can sell for over $16,000. Dried fins can sell for up to $200 a pound, and from an adult white shark, you can get anywhere from 60 to 100 pounds of dried fin off that shark. That doesn't include the meat. So quite often in many of the commercial fisheries throughout Southern California, when the babies were caught, they were quite often taken to market and sold as shark meat in markets. In addition, we know that because they've never occurred in high abundance, there's never been any directed fishery for white sharks. At best, they've been bycatch in many of these other commercial fisheries. However, despite the fact that they would occasionally nibble on people, we had the wherewithal in places like California to enact protection for them because of their life history, their vulnerability to being overfished. So they were protected from commercial fishing and recreational fishing in 1994. They were protected throughout the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico in 1997. They were protected by CITES, so their teeth and jaws and skin and fins could not be traded internationally in 2004. And in 2005, they were protected throughout the rest of the US waters. So white sharks have been protected in pretty much every place they occur in abundance: Mexico, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and the US for anywhere from 10 to 20 years. So if we just look at the gillnet fishery in California, and we look at how that fishery changed. So that fishery grew, started in the 70s, peaked in the mid-80s. So the lines you see represent the number of nets being set. So in Southern California alone, there were over 1,000 permits issued for gillnet fishing. Even small boats, 30-foot boat, people were setting gillnets out of. And they were targeting things like white sea bass, halibut, angel sharks, and then offshore they were targeting things like tuna, swordfish, and sharks. So we see those fisheries peak in the mid-80s, but then you see the effort start to decline. Those bars you see are the number of sharks reported caught in that fishery during those time periods. So what you see is the number of sharks go up and the number of babies being caught in that fishery go up. And then as the fishery declines, the numbers go down. But in 1994, two important things happened. One, white sharks were protected by the state legislature. So if fishermen caught them, they had to let them go. But the other thing the state of California did, which was amazing, was they banned the use of gillnets in state waters. Now, in California, this was a big deal because fishery regulations are made by the Fish and Game Commission. This, however, because marine mammals and birds were being killed in that fishery, this was brought to the voters. The voters voted on Prop 132 to ban the use of gillnets in state waters. So after 1994, it was illegal to set gillnets in state waters. If you look at that graph, gillnet effort has not changed in the last 20 years. Inshore or offshore, whether it's 3 miles out or fishing offshore for drift gillnet fishery. But look at the number of white sharks being reported caught in that fishery after an 82% reduction. So in 2012, I presented some of these data, and to me, what that shows is a sign of population increase. It's a sign of increased recruitment. You can't have more babies without having more mommies. So remember, the gillnet ban and protection goes into place in 1994, and it's really after 2005 that we see this big uptick. So to me, that signifies population increase. Now, this didn't actually go over very well with many of my colleagues. And the reason is because for the previous 10 years, we have been telling the public shark populations are in trouble. We have overfished shark populations, and we have to do more to protect them. So how can this population, the king, if you will, of apex predators, be coming back when many others are showing signs of decline? The other thing that we began to realize is that technology was opening our eyes to the types of sharks white sharks were. So my colleagues at Stanford University and Marine Conservation Science Institute started tagging white sharks when they would be in close to these feeding aggregations during the fall months with satellite telemetry tags. And those satellite telemetry tags changed our idea of what kind of shark a white shark is. They showed that these sharks are at those feeding aggregations until the elephant seals leave. When the elephant seals leave, so did the white sharks. Where do they go? To the middle of the Pacific. They go out to an area between Baja and the Hawaiian Islands. And they spend anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half out there before some of those individuals return to those aggregation sites. So we know that those feeding sites are important to these sharks, but we also know that in the spring, between May and October, white sharks are coming to Southern California for another reason. Females are coming into Southern California to give birth to their babies. And the way we know that is based on fishing records. So it is not uncommon for recreational fishermen to catch neonatal baby white sharks off many of our beaches and coastal piers in those summer months. So based on this, it was hypothesized that the Southern California bight was a nursery for white sharks in the Northeast Pacific. So in 2006, we started collaborating with Monterey Bay Aquarium. Now, Monterey Bay Aquarium wanted to be able to keep a white shark on exhibit. And they have a really good philosophy about these things. They're not going to keep anything that they do not study. So they funded research. They wanted us to tag baby white sharks and find out where they go, what types of habitat do they need, so that they could develop an exhibit that would be adequate for them. So Monterey Bay Aquarium has probably put more money into white shark research than any country or any state. They've put millions of dollars into studying white sharks. So in order to catch these sharks that we know aren't very abundant, we turned to commercial fishermen who were already catching them. So we started partnerships with many of the gillnet fishermen that were fishing in Southern California. Of course, they're fishing outside 3 miles. And what we did was we said, look, if you catch a baby white shark, call us up. Tell us when you're going to be at the dock. And my students and I would rush down to the dock to meet the fishermen. And we had certain questions that we wanted to answer in regards to sharks caught by these fishermen. One question we want to answer is, do sharks caught in a gillnet die if we release them? So that was the number 1 question. Number 2 question is, if they don't die, where do they go? And then, of course, we want to know what is the degree of interaction? So are gillnet fishermen catching the same sharks over and over again that they release? Are they catching different sharks? What is the degree of interaction between the fishery? And then, of course, how far do they migrate? Do they stay in Southern California? Do they migrate offshore like the adults? And, of course, do they have fidelity to the naval habitat? So if we catch them, they're caught in a gillnet, we tag them, they move off somewhere, do they return? So our fishermen partners would call us up. Here's a baby white shark in a fish tote. That's 4 feet by 4 feet. Those are legal-sized California halibut. That shows you how small that little white shark is. They would drive maybe 3 or 4 hours all the way back to the dock. We'd meet them at the dock, and then my students and I could take a series of measurements. We'd take a blood sample, a tissue sample for genetics, and they would instrument these sharks with a variety of different transmitters to try to answer those questions. So the types of transmitters we use would enable us to answer different types of questions. So one type of tag we use are called spot tags, spot satellite tags. Now these get bolted to the shark's dorsal fin. That tag only works when the shark's dorsal fin breaks the surface. It transmits to the satellite. Then I get an email back at my office giving me the latitude and longitude of where the shark popped up. When the shark goes back underwater, it turns off. Now, when we first started putting these very expensive tags on these sharks, we thought, are we going to get any data at all? These are not marine mammals. They do not have to come to the surface to breathe. So we thought, well, we better use another tag as well. So we also put on pop-off archiving satellite tags, PAT tags. Now, PAT tags have a temperature sensor, a depth sensor, and a light sensor, and a little computer on board that's constantly recording all that information. At a pre-described time and date, the tag is designed to pop off the shark, float to the surface, download all the data to the satellite, and then send it to me in an email. So based on that, we get a really detailed record of the depth and the temperature of the water that the shark moved through. But we also get a kind of a coarse indication of where the shark had traveled. And of course, we know exactly where the tag popped up. So we could tell how far the shark might have migrated. But if we really want to know how close the shark gets to the shoreline, for example, we use acoustic telemetry. So acoustic transmitters, some of which we surgically implant into the shark's body cavity, have a unique ID code, and they use an ultrasonic ping. So that ping cannot be heard by the sharks or many other animals, but when they're within 500 yards of one of those underwater acoustic receivers that we have all along the coast, the receiver would record the time, the date, and the ID number of the shark as it swam by. So think of this like Easy Pass on the toll roads, when you're driving down the road and it sends you a bill at the end of the month. The only difference is we get the bill. The sharks didn't get the bill. So we could use this as a tool to track the sharks even when they weren't at the surface. So our first question was, well, what happens to these sharks that are caught in the commercial fishery? So the graph you see here, this figure you see, is an indicator of how much gillnet fishing effort occurred in each block during 2006 to 2009. The redder the block, the greater the number of net hours set. So the first thing that you notice is that gray line that hugs the coastline, that's state waters. So remember, they can't fish inside that. So those red blocks are where all the symbols seem to overlap. So those symbols that you see are locations where commercial fishing partners had caught a baby white shark, and then we had tagged them and subsequently released them. Now, if you look at that figure, you go, ooh, that's bad. Because all the reddest spots have all the locations where the sharks were caught. Well, of course it does. That's where they were caught. But what if we use those spot tags where the shark pops up and we get a detection to tell us where the sharks are after they're released? So the other thing I want to point out is that square around there, that's Santa Monica Bay. But you'll notice that a majority of the sharks were tagged off Ventura by Santa Barbara. So the next figure I'm going to show you are our spot detections. All the white symbols you see are spot detections of sharks inside 3 nautical miles. Now, these are the highest resolution detections we could get. So they give us the greatest spatial accuracy. So you'll notice that over 44% of all the detections are inside state waters where gillnet fishing is not allowed. So it's basically a marine protected area for white sharks from gillnet fishing. All the black dots you see are locations outside protected areas where white sharks could be caught. Now, the interesting pattern that you see here is that not all the black dots are in the reddest squares. So these sharks aren't spending all their time in the places where the fishers are fishing the most. In addition, you'll notice that a lot of the sharks that were tagged in Ventura are also spending a lot of time in Santa Monica Bay where gillnet fishing is not allowed at all. So this is a really interesting finding because it shows that there is some degree of commercial fishing interaction, but it's not as great as you would think just based on where fishing is occurring and where captures occur. So one of the things we noticed over the 6 or 8 year period that we were working with commercial fishermen was some years there would be a lot of dead sharks in the net and some years there wouldn't. So we started asking the fishermen a little bit more about how they fished. And one of the things that we found that was really interesting was for the sharks that they brought us back that were alive, that we managed to put tags on, 94% survived. Now, people, in commercial fishing, number one, these data are good as gold. We don't get these data for commercial fishing. Number two, those survival rates are absolutely amazing. They're amazing. 94% of the sharks that were in nets, and we have no idea how long they were in the net. But those sharks survived when we were monkeying with them and prodding them and measuring them. They survived. However, one of the things we found from talking to the fishermen was if they didn't check their nets in a day, so let's say they weren't catching a lot of fish, and in 24 hours they decide, I'm going to leave my nets out another 24 and see if I'm getting fish before I go out and spend all the money on fuel. We found that if they checked their nets in under 24 hours, there was a higher likelihood of a shark being found live in the net. However, if they waited another day, they waited 40 hours, there was a much higher likelihood of a shark being found dead in the net. Now, when we shared these data with the fishermen, we said, look, you guys are getting a lot of heat from the conservation groups about killing baby white sharks. Here are data that you can use to help yourself stay out of trouble. Because if you check your nets in less than 24 hours, we have good evidence that those sharks that you shake out of your nets can survive. So this was great. Unfortunately, some conservation groups still put forth petitions to list white sharks as threatened and endangered. And when they did that, our commercial fishing partners didn't want to be our partners anymore. So we lost our ability to get sharks from that group. So we had to do it ourselves. So this is the expensive way to do it. So what we could do is we could hire a commercial purse seiner, we'd hire a spotter pilot who would then show us where the sharks were. They would set the net around the shark. We could braille up the net, tighten up the net, and take the shark out of the net, and then do all the same things we did to the shark then if we got it from a commercial fisherman and let the shark go. Now this is a great technique because literally in less than an hour, we could encircle the shark, do everything we needed to, and let it go again. The problem is it costs about $5,000 a day to do this. So it was a very expensive approach, not including the bling that we put on them, to get answers to the questions. The other problem we ran into is because of our Cal Fish and Game permit would not allow us to fish within 900 feet of a beach. The other thing that we noticed is that these sharks are actually very close to the shoreline, literally just outside the wave break. So we had to develop another way of getting tags into sharks that didn't include this. This is where we used our new partners, lifeguards. So in the last 10 years, Southern California lifeguards have been dealing with a new problem, and it's not drunken people on the beach, it's shark sightings. So the lifeguards are going, what is going on? There are all these sharks, we don't know what to do about this problem. We said, great, we'd love to help you, we'll give you information, but can you help us? And they said, well, how can we help? I said, well, all those baby white sharks are in the lineup underneath your surfers. We need help getting access to them. And they said, okay, we have some ideas. So the idea is we would put my grad students on a tow board behind a jet ski. We would have a spotter pilot or a drone pilot telling the jet ski operator where the shark was. And then as the shark would swim by, my grad students would roll into the water, as you'll see in a minute, and dart a tag into the shark's back. So quite often when they were done and they would stand up, they would be in waist deep water. So these little sharks are literally 200 feet off the beach and sometimes in water less than 3 feet deep. So using this technique, we could tag 4 to 6 sharks in a morning. It was great. The problem with that is anything you put on the outside of the animal, they're crafty about finding ways of getting rid of. So we could only keep these tags on the outside of the sharks about 2 years before they would be shed. So now, how do we use all this data to figure out where these sharks are going, to answer some of those other questions? So what I'm going to show you here is a simulation of a shark, not a simulation, actual track of a shark using the PAT tag data. So what you're going to see is the sea surface temperature for every day. You're going to see a clock ticking away. And you're going to see this shark that was caught in Ventura in 2012. And this shark is a baby. It's about 5.5 feet long at birth. And the black smudge you see there is the path. So notice that here we are in August. The water's pretty warm down south. In Southern California, it's still up around maybe 70, 68 degrees. The water starts cooling down in December. The shark migrates south to Baja. And it ends up at a place called Vizcaino Bay, which is one of the largest bays along the Baja Peninsula. So then by January, the satellite tag pops off and we lose contact with the shark. But what that showed us was that every other shark that we had tagged at this period basically spent their whole first summer along Southern California beaches, but normally around November, December, when our water temperatures would start to drop, when they get below 60 degrees, these sharks booked it south, and they hugged the coast. Now, the next shark I'm going to show you is really cool, because this shark was caught in Ventura in 2012, but taken to Monterey, put in the exhibit. This shark was kept there for 6 months, and the only reason why they let it go was because it was eating its tank mates. That shark gained 100 pounds in 6 months. But they released that shark in Monterey Bay in February. Okay, so what's the water temperature in February in Monterey Bay? Pretty darn cold. It's about 52 degrees, 50 degrees. Watch what this shark does. Bam, man, it's cold. It's hightailing it. Passes Southern California, goes all the way down to Mazatlan to warm up. So here we are, this is April, May. Look at that slug of warm water coming up from the equatorial Pacific, and it drives this shark up into the Gulf of California. That shark, once that surface water temperature got above 28 degrees Celsius, that shark went deep. So it started hanging out about 100 meters deep before the satellite tag popped off. So these tracks, and we have a bunch of these different tracks, show us that water temperature is an important driver for migration for these baby white sharks. Now, we also were hearing from the public that not only were our spot tags telling us that these sharks are close to the shore, but the public is telling us these sharks are very close to the shore. So here's an aerial photograph. Pacific Coast Highway is literally just off the screen. So we're talking maybe 200 feet off the beach. Those are 2 stand-up paddleboarders you see there. How many white sharks do you see? 5. That's kelp. That other chunk up there is kelp. So in an area the size of a football field, we have counted as many as 14 baby white sharks milling around literally 200 feet off a beach. Sometimes underneath surfers, stand-up paddleboarders, swimmers. So these little sharks, when they find a particular beach, they tend to use that area. They'll use that area for a month or more at a time, day and night. And then they'll hop to another beach. So the way we know that they're beach hopping is based on the other technology we're using. So we use acoustic telemetry to track their movement. So remember those acoustic receivers I told you that we had underwater? So we have them all along the beaches in Southern California, all the way up to Central California. And then my collaborator, Oscar Sosa, who's a professor in Mexico, is also studying baby white sharks down in Baja. And he had a series of receivers in what is called Scammons Lagoon in Vizcaino Bay. So Scammons Lagoon are where the gray whales go to give birth to their young in the winter. So what we were able to do is track these little white sharks. So the animation I'm going to show you is in 2015. Anybody remember anything that important that happened in 2015, 2016? It was a little warm. In Southern California it was. We had that strong El Nino. And as a result, our water temperature stayed warm year-round. So what you're going to see are detections of white sharks. Up top is the date and time counter. So here we are in March, April. We're getting detections of sharks in all these different locations at those beaches. Now, there are receivers between those areas. We didn't get any detections. So sharks are hanging out at specific hotspot beaches. So here we are. We're coming into October. We're in August. Sharks are still being detected. They're moving up and down the coast, bopping between these beaches, spending up to 40 days at a particular beach. Here we are in October. Now, normally, October, November is when our water temperatures start to drop. But in 2015, they never did. Our water temperatures stayed way into the 60s. Those sharks never left. So for 2 years, all the babies that we tagged in the previous summer during 2014, 2015, and 2016 never migrated to Baja. They all stayed. Those are babies. Once they become 1-year-olds, their behaviors change, and I'll show you that in just a second. So here's an example of a shark that we tagged in 2012 as a baby. It was caught off Ventura, and you're going to see this little animation. There's the date and time counter. You're going to see a little shark moving. So it was first detected off San Onofre, kind of moves up into Southern California. We get a bunch of detections at Santa Monica, and then in the winter, this shark migrates down in 2013 because it was a cold winter, and it overwinters in Scammons Lagoon. It spent 4 months in Scammons Lagoon. And then, of course, once we get into June, July, boom, back to Southern California. It's now a 1-year-old, right? So now we're in 2014, spends a few months up there, comes back the next winter to Scammons Lagoon. So this is 2 migrations it's made. It's in Vizcaino Bay and Scammons Lagoon, back to Southern California. Now it goes up to Central California. So remember, in 2015, it's an El Nino year, so the water's warmer along the Central California coast. So now this shark goes all the way up to Morro Bay before we detect it last. So what we figured out is that that first summer for those babies, those warm beaches are really important. But when the water temperature drops, they migrate south. After they're over 1 year old, and they've made that migration once, they'll make that migration more than once. Now the next one I'm going to show you was also tagged in 2012. So this shark is detecting regularly in Santa Monica, goes down, makes its winter migration because it's cold in those winters, back down to Vizcaino Bay, made a slow migration. Overwinters in Vizcaino Bay. So here we are in the winter, get down there September, October, December, regular detections during January, February, not much from that shark at that point, and then it comes back to Southern California. Except this time it goes to the Channel Islands. Now it goes out to San Miguel. This is where the seal and sea lion rookeries are. So this shark, this is 2015, the shark's 3 years old. That would put that shark somewhere between 8 and 9 years old, or excuse me, 8 and 9 feet long. So now it's back to San Miguel Island, and then this shark goes to Guadalupe. So these are 2 adult aggregation sites. These are sharks that are now 4 to 5 years old, so they're 9, maybe 8 to 10 feet long. They are now able to go to those adult aggregation sites, probably trying to feed on marine mammals, or at least scavenge on kills that other adults have taken down. But we're starting to see a shift from that nursery habitat to more juvenile adult habitat. So taking all this satellite tag data, and we're talking about $500,000 worth of data, my graduate student, Connor White, put together a mathematical spatial model. So what Connor asked was, if I take all the data that we got from the spot tags, and we look at the positions, and we look at how far that shark was offshore, and we look at the depth of water that that shark was over, relative to the water temperature at the surface at that time, and then he took daily sea surface temperatures, and he wanted to run a model that would use this really simple math, would tell us approximately what habitats we should expect to find white sharks across a 10-year period. So I'm only going to show you a few years of this model, but it's basically a habitat, what we call habitat suitability model. It predicts where we should expect to find animals based on their selection of certain habitat types. So here's this model. So the redder areas are where you'd have a high probability of finding a baby white shark, and the blue areas are where you wouldn't. So what you see is in the winter, the Gulf and southern Baja become important, but in the summer, Southern California becomes important. Now, if I were to run this model all the way through the El Nino period, what you would see is that actually Southern Baja gets too hot. And the sharks not only stay in Southern California during the winter, they actually move up the Central California coast. We had baby white sharks as far north as Monterey and Santa Cruz, because the water temperature off Monterey and Santa Cruz was 65 degrees. So this clearly shows the effects of El Nino on the movement. So if this temperature is what's driving the migration pattern of these young white sharks, what will rising ocean temperatures do in the future? So the cool thing about Connor's model is we could expand this globally. So we could even run it for the East Coast. So he ran this model for the East Coast, and you see the same sort of thing. So here we are in the winter, you see Cape Hatteras down along the Florida coast, and in the summer up off New England, Long Island, places like that. So basically, this is what you'd predict to see based on those habitat selection parameters that we saw from white sharks in the Pacific. Now, if we span in on this and we look at the number of months that would be habitable for this shark, we find that these hotspots occur up off New England, off Long Island Sound, and then off Cape Hatteras and off Georgia and places like that. If this in the winter months should be preferred habitat, and then up off this area should be preferred habitat in the summer. So what's really interesting was Connor ran this model last summer, and of course, Toby Curtis, who's here tonight, tagged some young of the year white sharks off Long Island last summer with OSearch. This is where they spent their summer, and this is where they spent their winter. So what's really cool about this is data from sharks on another coast is telling us a lot about the habitat requirements of these individuals, their physiology, and what they're looking for in terms of habitat. So while all this is going on, my colleague down in Mexico kept saying, hey, Chris, I don't think your sharks are always migrating down to Baja. I think we're seeing babies here too. And I kept saying, well, Oscar, how do you know that? And he said, well, we've been doing these fish surveys along all these fish camps in Baja. And one of the things we found when we were driving down these dirt roads are these shark dumps. So these are about a mile or two in from the fish camps. And basically what they would find are these carcasses. So when they started talking to the fishermen about these shark dumps, is they would say, the fishermen say, well, you never clean sharks where you fish because the scent of those dead sharks scare the other sharks away. So instead of cleaning their sharks there at the sites, they actually trucked them inland and dumped them. So they started rummaging through these dumps, and what they found were 62 heads of baby white sharks. So it was becoming clear that white sharks were being caught in this area of Baja. Now, first we thought, well, those could have been white sharks born in Southern California that migrated down and just so happened to be caught in the vast shark fisheries that occur in Baja. Well, when they started interviewing fishermen and talking to them and looking at the fish camps, one of the things they found were that young of the year white sharks, starting in May, were being caught by commercial fishers in this area just outside Scammons Lagoon. In addition, some of them were caught in Scammons Lagoon in May. So remember, none of the sharks that we had tagged in Southern California in May migrated to Baja during that time period. So this tells us that there may be actually two discrete nurseries. There's one in Vizcaino Bay and another one up here off Southern California. So far, we've only tagged individuals in Southern California to figure out that they migrate down to Vizcaino Bay in the winter, but a proportion of those individuals go back to Southern California the next year. So what we're trying to do now with Oscar and his team is tag young of the year white sharks in Vizcaino Bay this summer to see where do they go. Because if you remember from Connor's model, that area of Vizcaino Bay is suitable habitat 12 months out of the year. The other cool thing was one of Oscar's students collected genetic samples from us, from Southern California, from some of those mummied sharks in Baja. And then he got samples from Guadalupe Island from the adults in the Farallon Islands. And it turns out that the babies in Southern California are more closely related to females from Guadalupe than they are from the Farallons. So there's some interesting mixing going on here. So one of the things we want to try to answer are why certain beaches. Now, the public, the media, and of course the lifeguards want an answer to this question because every summer numbers keep going up. So what makes some of these hotspot beaches hotspots for these little sharks? So we're developing new tools to help us try to figure that out. So one of the tools that we're developing are autonomous underwater tracking robots. So we got funding from National Science Foundation, and I'm working with a roboticist from Harvey Mudd College to build these robots that have basically two hydrophones. We can put a transmitter on a shark, and then basically the robot is listening for the time, and the time hits one hydrophone before the other. And we can use that as a way of getting a bearing to where the shark is. We program the robot to swim like a shark. So as it swims from one side to the other, by the time it gets 3 detections, it knows exactly where the shark is in 3D space and time. Now we program the robot to be smart because we know the sharks can hear the robot, has a propeller, makes noise. So sometimes the shark starts swimming to the robot. The robot's programmed to swim away. The robot's programmed never to get within 50 meters, 100 meters, or 100 yards of the shark. The robots can also do something that myself and my students can't do. It can swim and chew gum at the same time. So the robot basically is like an oceanographic device. It's moving up and down through the water column. It's measuring temperature, light, depth, chlorophyll. We can instrument it with forward-facing sonar, so we can basically see in zero light. It's got video cameras. So we can program that to move around the shark, know exactly where the shark is in 3D space and time, and basically characterize the environment around the shark. So for the first time using this technology, we get insight into the shark's world. It gives us context as to why the shark is doing what it's doing. Another tool we're using to help augment that are called smart tags. So we call these smart tags, they're basically a 3D accelerometer and a 3D gyroscope that gets clamped onto the shark's back like a backpack. So this basically clamps onto a dorsal fin. So it's got a 3D accelerometer, gyroscope, temperature sensor, depth sensor. So we can record every single motion the shark is making in 3D. And it's recording it 25 times a second. It's also got an acoustic transmitter on it, so our robot or we can track it remotely. And then it's got a video logger so that we can see what the shark sees. So we tested this technology on leopard sharks. These are in California. They're relatively abundant. They're only about 5 feet long. So here's a leopard shark carrying a smart tag. There's the robot tracking it. And then what you're going to see in a minute is the video logger. So this is what the shark is seeing. So by using this, we can correlate some of this pattern with what the shark is seeing. So now we get even more context. Did the shark turn right because it encountered another shark? Did the shark go down because it was looking for a stingray? So by coupling these technologies, we're able to get answers to questions that we couldn't get 3 years ago. Another tool we're using, and this is in conjunction with the lifeguards, are the use of drones. Drones are becoming a very popular scientific tool. We use them to do surveys along the beaches because the sharks are in shallow water. They stand out really readily against the white sand or light-colored sand, so it's easy to spot them. But what we're trying to do is develop smart cameras that will enable us to determine not only how many sharks are present, but also the size of the shark. Can we measure the shark and provide real-time information on how big the shark is? So as you can see, the sharks are really disturbed by the jet skis. That shark's really agitated, as you can see. The problem was the lifeguards were so worried about the sharks that they tried to drive them off with the jet skis. It didn't work. The sharks really like the beaches just like the surfers do. So the other thing is we're working with computer scientists to develop basically software on board on the drones that will not only tell us the size of the shark, but identify individuals based on their swimming motion. So can we tell it's a white shark versus a leopard shark? So not only will we get the size, but we'll have pattern recognition that will tell us something about the species of the shark as well. Our goal is to not only use this for surveying along the beaches, but put this in the hand of lifeguards. So about 8 years ago, we helped the lifeguards to develop protocols on what to do about the shark problem, as they call it. And that shark problem included, okay, number one, a surfer comes in and says they saw a shark. Okay, fine. They have to confirm that it was a real sighting, so they have to send a lifeguard out to confirm it. The next thing is, if it's over 8 feet, they may opt to pull people out of the water. The reason for that is there are very few species of sharks over 8 feet that pose potential threats to people. However, they usually become a little less skittish after they're over 8 feet. After they're over the size of a surfboard, they become a little more curious. So the lifeguards go, well, how do we tell whether a shark's 6 feet or 8 feet? So by using this drone technology, they can use that as a tool that they can literally fly out of the back of their truck to go out and look for sharks. The other tool we're using, because you can't catch and tag every shark, despite our trials, is this technique, and it's called remote underwater video systems. Now, my colleagues that work in more remote places use what are called BRUVs. Those are baited remote underwater video systems. As you can imagine, this does not go over well with the lifeguards, right? So our goal is to deploy these off populated beaches, so we can go out, they're basically GoPros on a stick. So we have a PVC pipe, we have a weight. My students swim these out outside the break, they stick that in the sand. There's a GoPro pointing towards the beach and one pointing offshore. We turn the cameras on and let them run. Now the sharks are actually curious of the cameras and they'll swim up and take their own selfies. So the cool thing is we can then go back through the video data, and because each shark has unique markings along the gill, if we can get both sides of the shark, we can begin to build basically facial libraries of these sharks. So we're now working with programmers to develop facial recognition software for white sharks. So that will make this more automated. So this summer, I have 4 or 5 of these systems. My grad students will be going out to all these different beaches in Southern California, deploying these, and we'll use those as a way of seeing who's hanging out at what beach, even though we might not be able to tag them. Okay, so that kind of covers the things that I want to cover about our juvenile white shark stuff, but there's something else I want to talk about. And that is, we've recognized this problem of overfishing, and sharks have been part of that. And in fact, I told you, I had a hard time convincing some of my colleagues that the white shark population was increasing because that is not what we've seen over the last 100 years. We've seen populations kind of decline over the last 100 years due to systematic overfishing. Many species of marine mammals were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. We had dirty fisheries, we had bycatch problems, which we remedied back in the 1990s through increased regulation. We had basically a systematic loss of marine predators. So at that point, it wasn't like we didn't recognize this all of a sudden, oh, by the way, where'd all the sharks go? Where'd all the seals go? Where'd all the dolphins go? We've known these things for decades. And believe it or not, we've been legislating and regulating these things for decades. So examples, Marine Mammal Protection Act put in place in 1973. Marine mammals were already kind of in the tank by that point. But this piece of legislation has brought them back. Almost virtually all of them in U.S. waters have come back tremendously. We had the state ban of nearshore gill nets. That one thing that I showed you in Southern California is probably what allowed white shark populations to recover. Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is our federal fisheries act, which was designed to recover our commercial fisheries and to reduce bycatch. All these things have been improved on over the years. And in California, we passed the California Marine Life Protection Act, which required the state to develop fisheries management plans for all its fisheries and designate 20% of the coastline aside as a marine protected area. So we put these things in place because we recognize these problems, and these are not yesterday's problems. These have been decades' problems. Okay, so what do white sharks like to eat? Marine mammals. Well, since the Marine Mammal Protection Act was put in place, and I'm just going to use California sea lion as an example, because northern elephant seal, harbor seals, fur seals, all of them have shown this exact same trajectory. In 1920, marine mammal biologists thought California sea lion was on its way to extinction. They counted 2,000 in all of California and Mexico. If a fisherman saw them, they shot them. They were ground up and used as pet food. So in 1973, Marine Mammal Protection Act goes into place. Look at that trajectory. It starts shooting up. Then we see this little dip in the early 80s. That was a strong El Nino, which has big impacts on our marine mammal populations in California. We see it go up in the mid-90s. We see heavy regulation on commercial fisheries in terms of bycatch. Look at that trajectory. So by the mid-90s, most marine mammal populations were growing at rates between 6.5% and 10% per year, which marine mammal biologists thought was impossible. This is happening at the same time the public is being told the coastal oceans are completely overfished. This is our biggest carnivore. These things eat hundreds and hundreds of pounds of fish. So how can their populations be growing at 6.5% per year if there's nothing left? So one of the reasons why we believe white sharks have come back is because, number one, we protected them from fishing. But that alone wasn't enough. We had to protect their food source. Their food sources come back. That's helped. So, but what do sea lions eat? If we look at the other fisheries, so white sea bass, the gillnet fishery was primarily targeting white sea bass. The populations got hammered in a very short period of time. Since its ban, we're seeing white sea bass steadily recover. Other species caught in the gillnet fishery included giant sea bass, soupfin shark, leopard sharks. All these species, since the gillnet ban in 1994, are all steadily increasing. So if we put in management in place, we should be asking, is it working? And we have good scientific evidence to show it is. But many of these populations require on food, they require clean water in order to continue to grow at those rates. And if we look at water, we've had a bad history of treating our ocean waters poorly. Up until 1973, we were discharging raw sewage off the California coast, literally 1 mile. We had some of the worst water quality that existed anywhere in the nation. In 1971, or we were dumping industrial pollutants, all sorts of things. In 1972, the Clean Water Act gets passed. All that had to stop. We have 22 million people living in Southern California, all live within 60 miles of the coastline. All of them, every time they flush the toilet, it gets discharged out 6 pipes. We have cleaner water now than we did in the 70s with 5 times more people. So the bottom line is this was forced by regulation of the Clean Water Act. We have complete secondary treatment. We have the best wastewater treatment that exists anywhere in the world. In some cases, because of our water situation, it's a desert, by the way, if you didn't know, we are actually toilet to tap. So some of our wastewater treatment are completely recycling water. So the bottom line is we recognized the effects that we were having in the environment. We regulated, and regulation led to innovation. And that innovation has allowed for more people to live and prosper along the coast. We still have problems. We still have coastal trash and things like that get in the ocean, but we're doing things constantly to fix that. And of course, anything that goes in the atmosphere ends up in the water and then can affect marine life. So many of you are probably well aware of some of the horrible air pollution that we had in Southern California. We had some of the worst in the country. Once again, Californians went to Washington and pushed hard for the Clean Air Act. So basically in 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed. Now, with 5 times more people, 28 times more cars. If you've ever been to LA, you'll know what a lot of cars. You think it's bad in Boston? Come to my neck of the woods. We have cleaner air now than we did 40 years ago. So the bottom line is, all of these things have been working in concert to bring back our predators. So it's taken decades. That's why the public's going, what's going on? Where do all these sharks come from? Because it takes decades for their populations to recover. And it's been happening. So in addition, I would argue that it's not just protection and better fisheries management that's allowed that to happen. We're seeing the restoration of ecosystem function. So I would argue that recovery of white sharks is probably our greatest conservation success story. I would argue that that shows that animals at the top of the food chain are the ones most susceptible in the ocean to ocean conditions. And if we can bring them back, that's a sign of things actually getting better. So the problem is, many of those predators have been fished out for over 50 years. So we had 2 generations of Americans that have basically had unfettered access to the ocean without having to worry about predators. We now use the ocean for a wide variety of recreational activities. And lo and behold, people are surprised when somebody gets bitten. Okay, so the thing is, we have more and more people going in the water. Shark populations are going up. There will be more incidents. What I'm still really surprised by are still how few those are, considering how many people use the water every day in Southern California. So the bottom line is, as shark populations come back, we have basically a predator ignorant public that we have to educate. And that requires, number one, good science to do that, to give them good information. But then we have to get that information out to them so that they can be predator savvy beach users. So things like catching baby white sharks off the piers has been a big problem for us. So they know they're white sharks, and they're using strategies and techniques that they're deliberately targeting them. So obviously we might have to do some increased regulation in that regard. But we're also seeing people doing crazy things around predators, like grabbing them and riding them and things like that, and that's asking for trouble. So we have a lot of education to do. So while you thought this talk was about sharks, it's about more than that. So what we should all be asking as American citizens is, we passed all this legislation, some of it decades ago. What we should be asking is it working? I would argue, and I hope I've given you some proof that it is. So do we really want to go backwards? So what I worry about now is this. So right now, there's serious concerns about undermining many of those regulations that have enabled much of the recovery that I think we've seen. So it'll be up to not just scientists to help make that stand. It'll be up to you. Thank you.
You mentioned they're catching white sharks off the piers. Has there been an effort to educate fishermen, or are they just ignoring information that's out there, or what's sort of the behind the whole?
So the question is, they're catching these baby white sharks off the piers. You know, what's going on there? Are they doing it deliberately? Do they just not know? And the answer to that question is both. So we know in some cases they don't know, and that's an education issue. And we know in some cases they do know, and that's a law enforcement issue. So one of the things we're working on is actually modifying the regulation. So sport fishing piers in California are really cool. They've been in existence for over 100 years. They were built to provide access for fishing. And it's actually legislated. It's in the California Constitution that be protected. However, times have changed, right? So, 100 years ago, people went out fishing on the piers. They might have caught a baby white shark. There was no way they're going to keep it. They didn't have gear big enough to stop it. So now what we're talking about is maybe we should make it illegal to use heavy tackle on the piers. In addition, some of these guys that are deliberately going out and doing that are chumming. These are public beaches. There are literally thousands of people in the water right by the pier. It's crazy. So these are things that require maybe some regulation, but a lot of education. The other thing that we found is the people that we have educated on the piers, when they see people doing that, they apply peer pressure. So they go over, you like that? They go over and they give them a hard time about using that kind of gear and doing that. And I think that's probably the best case that we can make in terms of changing behavior.
Observation and a question. The observation is, it's disturbing to hear that environmental and conservation groups, when hearing and seeing your data of fish recovery, refuse to believe it. Obviously, the conclusion is they just have a political agenda. Despite the science being shown to them, they're just going to continue along the way. And the second is a question. Given your grad students are jumping in the water, tagging sharks underwater, etc., what's the half-life of a grad?
Yeah, so first of all, your comment, I don't disagree with you in some cases. The second part about the grad students, we spend a lot of time training on how to interpret behavior, and they all sign a waiver. No, I'm only kidding. They don't have to sign a waiver. I'm pretty sure most of their parents know. I'm not sure all their parents know. But we do spend a lot of time training them to interpret behavior, because we don't want anybody to get hurt. And of course, we want to make sure that we give a good example to the public. We don't want the public doing this. So far, we've been very successful. My students are getting pretty good in judging behavior. There have been times when they've jumped in the water and the sharks started to act a little edgy and they backed off. So I'd rather them exercise good judgment and come away with all their parts than get another tag in a shark. Yeah.
Have you used your graduate students' model to predict possible changes in migration patterns given changing sea level temperatures?
Yeah, so that's the next step. So Connor used a whole variety of parameters. Those three that we identified were the most telling. Next goal will be to run that for 100 years based on sea temperature rise predictions to try to see where these nurseries may pop up. So he's in the process of doing that. Right now we're trying to get the first paper out, and then that's the next step. And of course, what we are hoping to be able to do, and we're already seeing this in certain places, people are experiencing sharks in places where they haven't had them before, or at least not in recorded history. So we believe that some of these habitat suitability models could be used for other species, not just white sharks. But when it comes to sharks, you know, that one gets people's attention. And of course, the nurseries, what we want to make really clear is that so far the nurseries haven't been problems. These little sharks are out there swimming around right underneath surfers. We have literally hundreds of thousands of people in the water. And all these little sharks on almost a daily basis during the summer, no problems. Wow, how much time do I have? Well, you know, the biggest concerns right now are with EPA regulations, right? So they're talking about pulling back some regulations in the EPA in terms of water and air quality. Those are big ones. I live in Southern California with 22 million people. It won't take long to go back if we start doing that. Now, the good thing is California has kind of drawn the line and said we won't do it. But that doesn't mean other states won't. In terms of some of the other things like wetlands protection, some of those other things are being questioned as well. So those are the ones that I find the most disturbing at this point, and of course they can snowball. So once we allow that backslide, the question is what will be next.
Two unrelated questions. One is you said Monterey Bay had a successful white shark in captivity. Were they the first?
So SeaWorld and a couple other aquaria worldwide had kept white sharks. The longest they've been able to keep them would be a day or two and they would die. Monterey was the first to be able to keep them for any period of time, and they've kept 6 on exhibit. After doing that, they've opted not to do it anymore. It's a really difficult process. It's very stressful for the aquarists. They go crazy when they have them on the exhibit because they're constantly worried about the sharks themselves and what the sharks do when the public are there. So as a result, they've opted not to keep white sharks anymore. But because of what they did, we learned a lot about white shark physiology. So you know, it was, you know, easily $2 million was put in just to the research part of that.
Just a question, I hope I say this correctly. How much does selection bias have to do with your research? Because you've focused on shore sharks, but you've caught them on the shore, so you're really you're kind of directing the results by your population. Does that make sense?
Yes. So our question was, are we biasing our sample because the only sharks we'll be able to catch and tag are been ones along the shore? Well, actually, that's where the fishermen come into play. So remember the fishermen that we got our sharks from originally? They can't fish within 3 miles. So they're actually offshore. They're at least 3 miles offshore. Now, we know from some of the satellite tag data that those little sharks that were caught outside 3 miles went into the beach, hung out along those beaches, and then would occasionally make forays out into the Santa Barbara or San Pedro Channel, where the water can be maybe 900 meters deep. So the sharks are spending all their time in the upper part of the surface waters, but then seem to come back to shore. So they'll make these excursions out to deeper water. You're right. I mean, there could be another population out there that we don't know about, but that's a dangerous place for a little white shark. And the argument I always make is white shark doesn't really know it's a white shark until it's over like 8 feet. When they're small, they're scared. I mean, they're scared of surfboards, they're scared of people. They're really kind of skittish. Once they get over that certain size, and you could see the sharks, once they got 2 or 3 years old, they're booking all over the place. I mean, they're in Mexico and back in the Channel Islands and Guadalupe, and they're big adult sharks out there. So for a little baby, that's a risky place to be.
Were you seeing a difference between males and females in terms of the behavior and where they were spending time?
So the question is, do we see a difference between the males and females in terms of where they spend their time? And the answer to that is not really. So we have kind of equal sample size between males and females. They seem to do the same sorts of things as babies. What will be really interesting is the ones that we surgically implant with the long-term acoustic transmitters, because we think that males mature earlier, but they're smaller than females. And we think that might be where they start parting ways and doing different things. So hopefully around that 5 to 7 or 8 years old is when we start to see some change, but that'll be the exciting part.
Do they ever venture further north, let's say to southern Oregon?
Okay, so do white sharks ever venture further north? So the adults do. In fact, we know that adult white sharks will go all the way to the Gulf of Alaska. So they can easily withstand those conditions. There have been white sharks caught off Oregon. Of course, there have been white shark attacks on surfers in Oregon. In British Columbia, white sharks have been found. So we know that they can go pretty far north. They probably don't stay all winter. They probably venture back out. But it's interesting that they're showing those kinds of movements. And what we might expect as sea surface temperatures continue to rise is that Oregon and Washington might start getting more white shark activity.
Yeah, that's actually leading into my question was if we see our ocean temperatures rising, is it possible that these shark nurseries are going to move more north? And then how will that, do you have any predictions of how that's going to impact those environments that are now facing, having an increase in these shark populations on the ecosystems as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So as sea surface temperatures continue to rise, the question is, will the nurseries move further north? So a lot of that question will depend on seasonal conditions, right? So if the summer temperatures increase warm, right, and it pushes that warmer temperature further north, what I would predict will happen is, yeah, you might get some pups born there, but they may only be there a month. Because if the winter temperatures start earlier, they're going to have to move. If what we're seeing is correct, they'll move. So it was that shark that was released in Monterey that tells us a lot about, they can survive those temperatures. They can survive down to probably 10 degrees Celsius. They just don't like it.
I know that different tags cause different levels of stress on sharks. I've never heard of the smart tag, so have you seen, I know it looks like it's fairly big on the dorsal fin. Does that change how the shark swims or different levels of stress in the shark?
So the question is, do any of the tags have impacts? And the answer is sure. We can't deny that they're going to have impacts. The smart tag that I showed you on a leopard shark, that was designed for a white shark. So we were testing it on a leopard shark, and they have really tiny fins. Poor thing, it was tired. We designed them to only stay on for 24 hours, and then they're designed to pop off and float to the surface so we can pick them up. So for the white sharks, that would be a much smaller package. It would fit the fin much better and would cause a little bit less drag. If we planned on keeping that on for a week, that would probably be a little too long. So our deployments will be anywhere from 1 day to 4 days, depending on how long we think the shark will stick around, because those cost about $10,000 a piece, and we don't want to lose them. Yeah. Thank you.